On the night of April 14th, 1912, the newest and greatest ship in the world, RMS Titanic, lay dead in the water, slowly sinking. The crew and the officers had done an in-depth inspection of their ship, and it was clear that she didn't have long to live. Captain Edward John Smith was faced with a horrifying reality, that his lifeboats held room for only a fraction of the more than 2,000 people aboard. The evacuation would need to be orderly and well executed if anybody was to survive at all, because rescue ships were still hours and hours away. He called his most senior officers to his side and made clear his plans, saying those now legendary words, "Put the women and children in and lower away." Today, we are all familiar with this moment. It's been depicted in plenty of films and TV dramas about the sinking because Titanic has become itself a celebrity of a ship. But back then, in 1912, Smith and his officers would have been very well aware of another ship's sinking, now almost forgotten, but which, for the time, was the closest thing to the Edwardians as the Titanic is to us today. In 1852, off South Africa, the troopship HMS Birkenhead broke up and sank, but incredibly, the ship's complement, mostly soldiers, stood in rank and file as the ship sank beneath their feet so that the women and children could get away safely. One of the 19th century's most dramatic and captivating maritime disasters, it captured the world's imagination and established the call for women and children first as the standard. There can be no doubt that as Titanic's captain and crew set about their work that night, the name of the other fateful vessel must have sounded through their minds at least once. It's a story of horrible loss, terrible danger, and incredible self-sacrifice. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the harrowing true story of the sinking of HMS Birkenhead. Late February 1852, and the steamer Birkenhead was steaming nicely through the calm waters off Western Cape, South Africa. The sea was still, and the conditions clear, basically perfect weather for any ship's crew. On board the vessel are about 640 men, women and children, most of them British soldiers drawn up from 10 different regiments on their way to a remote colonial conflict. With little wind, most British ships of the time would be in trouble, but not Birkenhead. She was the very latest thing in technology. Laid down in 1845 at the famous John Laird shipyard in England, Birkenhead's primary method of propulsion was a pair of 564 horsepower steam engines that drove paddles on either side of the ship's hull. She still carried masts rigged with sails, but her engines could keep her moving even when the wind had dropped off. That evening, Birkenhead churned through the ocean at an impressive 8.5 knots, but she could manage at least 13. The ship was heavily laden down, with hundreds of passengers and crew and tons of stores and provisions packed into the hold. The 210-foot, 64-metre ship displaced around 2,000 tons. She'd originally been designed as a warship, a frigate, to be armed with old-fashioned cannons, but by this point ships had started to be built with iron hulls. Birkenhead was one of them. It meant that in a classic ship-on-ship broadside engagement, any shot holes in an iron hull couldn't be easily plugged by a carpenter as they could on wooden ships. Now this was a strange era in ship design when some vessels used the latest technology and were simply too far ahead of their time. It was decided that Birkenhead would have more use as a troopship because, at the time, Britain's empire was vast and spanned tens of thousands of miles. The Empire's troops needed to get to such far-flung places as India, Africa, and even Australia. Fancy that. A ship of Birkenhead's size could carry nearly a full regiment of men to bolster the garrisons. So it was that Birkenhead spent the first few years of her life laid up before full conversion to troopship duties were finished. And finally, in January 1852, Birkenhead got the chance to show what she could do. Britain was engaged in the 8th Xhosa War. Displaced Xhosa tribes and Khoikhoi people had attacked colonial settlers because they had been subjected to incredible hardships from their resettlement. It was a brutal conflict that would go on to last about 2 years, and the scant British forces there needed bolstering. Birkenhead was called up to take troops from 10 different regiments, departing first from Portsmouth, where then she would steam for Queenstown near Cove, Ireland, then swing down for the Cape. Birkenhead would need to deposit many of the passengers and soldiers near Cape Town before then steaming on to deposit the rest of the reinforcements at Algoa Bay in Eastern Cape. This was an era where soldiers and officers' wives and children often followed their men. In fact, in the Napoleonic age, armies were often followed by an enormous nomadic train of craftsmen, supplies, armourers, and the usual support you'd need for an army, but also the hundreds of wives and children. In the Victorian age, things weren't as extreme, But still, Birkenhead had picked up dozens of women and children to take to South Africa with their husbands and fathers. Fortunately, most were let off at the first stop. Birkenhead set off and the trip was expected to take about a month. The ship was commanded by Captain Robert Salmond, a stern Scotsman of the Royal Navy, about whom relatively little is known. Aboard his ship were about 500 soldiers of regiments like the 2nd Queen's Surreys, the 12th Lancers, the 60th King's Royal Rifle Corps, even the 73rd Foot Regiment, now better known as the Black Watch, under the watchful eye of 2 senior officers, Captain Edward Wright and Major Alexander Seaton. Seaton had never been on campaign, but Wright was a veteran. Birkenhead's voyage was marked almost from the start as a doomed venture when she was steaming straight into a terrifying gale which battered the ship and threatened to sink her. Fortunately, her paddles meant the ship could keep her bow pointed into the worst of the weather, and for the better part of 2 full weeks, Birkenhead battled the elements. When at last the storm cleared, it was obvious that the soldiers, many of whom had never even seen the sea, were effectively physically defeated by their brush with the ocean's might. You can only imagine the hellish conditions down below in the ship's dormitories, but still, Birkenhead chugged along bound for Africa. After more than a month of steaming, Birkenhead arrived on February 23rd at Simon's Bay, near Cape Town. Many soldiers who were too ill had to be disembarked, along with most of the women and children aboard. But little did they know that even though Birkenhead's ultimate destination at Algoa Bay was only a few days away, their leaving the ship would probably save their lives. With 640 still aboard, Birkenhead had resupplied and at last set out for Algoa Bay. Captain Salmond, likely frustrated by the delay caused by the huge storm, decided to maintain a course that hugged the coast, and which would, in theory, get his ship to her destination sooner. Late at night, shortly before 2 a.m, the ship's leadsman took a depth reading which revealed 12 fathoms, 22 metres or 72 feet of water, beneath the ship. Now Birkenhead had something of a curious quirk. She'd actually been designed and built by a very capable shipbuilder, but government interference had dashed their original plans. Originally, Birkenhead would have sat quite evenly in the water with a draft of about 15 feet, 9 inches or just under 5 metres, but the Admiralty had suggested that the shaft of the paddle wheels be moved further forward. Now this small change upset Birkenhead's trim and meant that she was actually quite bow heavy. It's not entirely certain if this impacted what happened to the Birkenhead that night, or if Salmond had just adjusted for this issue by loading his ship heavier further aft to ease the trim. But regardless, just after the leadsman took his depth reading, there was a sickening, grinding crunch as Birkenhead's heavy bow was ripped and torn by something in the water. Seemingly out of nowhere, an uncharted rock had torn into the ship's hull. The depth under keel had suddenly jumped from 22 metres, 72 feet, to just 2 fathoms, 3.7 metres, or only 12 feet beneath the bow. Because of her unusual trim, Birkenhead was likely down by the head. You wonder, if she'd been correctly trimmed, she might have just cleared the rocks by steaming over the top of it. That wasn't the only condition working against Birkenhead that night. The unusually calm weather meant there were no waves breaking on the base of the rock, or, if it was submerged by the tide, no telltale disturbed white water over the top of the shoal. Salmond, half-dressed, raced on deck and ordered the anchor deployed and the engines run astern to try to free his ship, but this move proved fatal. The best thing he could have done in a situation like that is probably to keep the ship grounded firmly on the rocks to prevent it from sinking in deeper water. But as Birkenhead worked herself free, the rocks tore even more of the hull open. For those on deck, it would have been evidenced by a grinding sensation underfoot, but down in the hull, it was very different. Men, soundly asleep, were awakened as thousands and thousands of gallons of water suddenly roared into their dormitories, and over 100 are estimated to have drowned where they slept. Birkenhead's iron hull had been cleverly divided into 8 watertight compartments, but the rocks tearing at the hull had opened almost all of them up to the ocean, and those that were originally watertight had been cut open to allow men to move more freely throughout the ship. It meant Birkenhead suddenly started to sink very quickly. With only a few meagre quarter boats available, it was clear there could be no hope of evacuating any significant portion of the ship's complement. In the bow, dozens of men quickly rushed to man the ship's pumps, discharging floodwater over the side. Clearly, it was a lost cause, but at least it would keep the ship afloat long enough to hopefully get some of the boats away. They were uncovered and rigged to the simple davits to be swung over the ship's side. Salmond ordered one of the marine drummers to beat to quarters, and slowly the soldiers, as well as the ship's own marines, gathered on deck. Paintings would go on to show them standing to attention in their immaculate red coats, but the truth was that most of them were barely dressed or wrapped in blankets because they'd been so hastily called out from down below. The ship's captain found Major Seaton and calmly asked if he would, quote, be kind enough to preserve order and silence among the men. With about 60 men at the pumps and 60 others working to free the lifeboats, the remainder were ordered to stand in rank at the stern with the hope that the bow would be raised somewhat by their weight. Lieutenant Colonel Seaton walked up and down the ranks. Even though he was an academic officer and had never seen combat, he knew that he had to keep his men in check. With a firm voice, he asked them to stay in place, and they dutifully followed his commands. In fact, there wasn't any noise save for the men toiling at the boats and the horses stamping their feet. This is when Salmond made history. As the soldiers stood unmoved on the ship's decks, now ominously tilting down by the head, the captain ordered the women and children into the boats. He was adamant there could be no panic, and the troops would not break file or rush the lifeboats. To their credit, the men simply stood and watched as the chaos began to unfold around them. Captain Salmond's plan had been for his ship to float free of the rock, and then either remain afloat long enough for help to arrive, or for the ship to be beached. The quarter boats were lowered over the side, and then loading got underway. First, one of the ship's cutters with about 7 women and 9 children. The boat was filled with other officers and men, and set out. So too did the next cutter and the ship's gig. In all, about 62 soldiers and 3 Marines boarded the boats, along with a young officer and the ship's surgeon. Salmond then had the men frantically set to work on the boats kept atop the paddle box. They would be able to get more away to safety yet. But then, with the evacuation efforts properly underway and the men tearing at the paddle box boat tackles, the unthinkable happened. With their engines still running astern, 10 minutes after the original impact, Birkenhead impacted the bottom again, but this time it would prove fatal. The engine room was torn open and tons of water rushed in, dousing the boilers. The ship lurched heavily, but the soldiers still stood in their ranks. It was clear that she was doomed, and then the end came incredibly quickly. The hull was subjected to enormous forces. With a roar, the bow section, with dozens of men still inside trying to work the pumps, broke free from the stern, disintegrated and sank almost immediately. The decapitated ship lurched underfoot and threw many of the soldiers to the deck. Over their heads, the ship's tall funnel came down right on top of the starboard paddle box where the men were working to free the boats there. They were killed and the paddle box itself carried away by the wreckage. Captain Salmond knew the end had come, and he called out, "Save yourselves, all those who can swim, jump overboard and make for the boats. This is your only hope of salvation." But Seaton, overseeing his men, knew that a break in ranks would probably end in disaster. Even as Birkenhead's decks began to be swallowed by the ocean, he shouted, "The cutter with the women and children will be swamped. I implore you not to do this thing, and I ask you to stand fast." Amazingly, the men listened, and only 3 broke their ranks. This display of discipline can only have come from the years of harsh drill and military training that taught men to stand firm in the face of cavalry attacks or volleys of gunfire and canister shot. But it must have been more than that. These hundreds of men were now faced with almost certain death, but they barely moved, even as the water swirled wide around their feet. A survivor, Captain Edward Wright of the 91st, wrote, "The order and regularity that prevailed on board from the time the ship struck until she totally disappeared far exceeded anything that I thought could be effected by the best discipline." And it is the more to be wondered at, seeing that most of the soldiers were but a short time in the service. Everyone did as he was directed, and there was not a murmur or cry amongst them until the ship made her final plunge. I could not name any individual officer who did more than any other. All received their orders and had them carried out as if the men were embarking instead of going to the bottom. There was only this difference, that I never saw any embarkation conducted with so little noise or confusion. Attempts at lowering one of the other paddle box boats, probably on the port side, failed when a line gave way and it tumbled into the sea. Finally, about 20 minutes after the initial impact, the end came for Birkenhead. The stern section dropped, the men were gradually swallowed up by the boiling waters, and Seaton's last cry was, "God bless you all." He was never seen again. It was over 2 miles, or about 3.3 kilometers to shore, and most of those men had no experience with water whatsoever. It was only then, once they were in the water, that the panic came, and shouts and screams echoed in the night. But almost as soon as Birkenhead disappeared beneath the waves, an eerie silence once again fell over the scene. Those who couldn't swim were drowned, but many banded together to attempt the Herculean 2-mile swim to shore. They never tried to swarm the lifeboats. Amazingly, dozens of men actually made it and landed, exhausted, on the shore, having had to battle their way in the final short stretch through thick seaweed that pulled many down. Around 50 reached landfall, but around them as they had swum, dozens more of their comrades and friends met their end, thanks to sharks. They came out in their dozens and attacked the men in the water. Lieutenant J.F. Giraudoux survived the sinking and later wrote to his father. He said, "I remained on the wreck until she went down. The suction took me down some way and a man got hold of my leg, but I managed to kick him off and came up and struck out for some pieces of wood that were on the water and then started for land about 2 miles off. I was in the water about 5 hours, as the shore was so rocky and the surf ran so high that a great many men were lost trying to land. Nearly all those that took to the water without their clothes were taken by sharks. Hundreds of them were all around us, and I saw men taken by them close to me, but as I was dressed, having on a flannel shirt and trousers, they preferred the others." A young ensign, Alexander Russell, was found in the water during the night and picked up by one of the ship's cutters. He was taken aboard, but soon they came across another survivor who was initially turned away because the boat was full. Russell insisted the man be taken on and instead took his place in the water, but just 5 minutes later, he was taken by a shark. The ship's boats banded together through the night and then, the next day, attempted their own landings on the rocky shoreline. Sadly, had more senior officers survived in the boats, a nighttime landing could have been possible, and more in the water might have been saved, ferried to and from the shore throughout the night. But as it was, the early morning daylight revealed a scene of carnage and chaos. Bodies and wreckage floated in the waves. At the shore, the men who had successfully landed recovered other pieces of the ship which men had tied themselves to try to survive the night, but nearly all of them were dead. The paddlebox boat, which had dropped into the sea, eventually came ashore with some men alive and clinging to it. A Coronet Bond, the young officer who survived, later said, "Other bodies washed up, many of them dreadfully mangled by sharks." Amazingly, after Bond reached the shore, he found his horse was alive and well. The animals had been freed as the ship sank, and somehow his mount had managed to swim the 2 miles to safety. The next day, a small sailing schooner named Lioness reached the wreck site and found 40 or so men still alive, clinging to the ship's rigging, which still jutted high out of the water. They had survived the night and were taken aboard safely. Locals were alerted by a party of survivors who'd swum ashore. They managed to gather their strength and trudged 9 miles inland without shoes to raise the alarm. A whale boat eventually plucked more survivors out of the water, some of whom had drifted for 38 hours. For days afterwards, boats patrolled the rocks and the shore to search for survivors, but it was clear the death toll had been immense. Of the 640 odd who'd been aboard, only about 190 were left alive to tell the tale. Captain Salmond had been spotted in the water, but it's thought a piece of wreckage came down on him and he was knocked unconscious and drowned. None of the senior officers, including Seaton, survived. They had been preoccupied to the last by keeping their men in order. The last request for the men to stay in place as Birkenhead broke up and sank had been just that, a request and not an order. The men had obliged and the boats had got away safely because of it. The news caused an absolute sensation, first in Britain and then the world. The fact that these men had stood so calmly in the face of certain death appealed to a certain sense of Victorian dutifulness. Less praised was the captain and crew of Birkenhead. Salmond had been running his ship extremely close to the shore, but he was not on watch when the ship had struck the reef. The initial depth sounding should have served as a warning that something dangerous was ahead, but the course was kept. Some of the crew were called before a trial, but any charges of negligence were dismissed because the captain and the senior officers had been lost. Seemingly overnight, the men of the Birkenhead became a sensation. Newspapers carried the headlines first, but then artists and poets got in on the story with commissioned pieces praising their martyrdom. Obviously, the Admiralty, who were dealing with a huge disaster and possible scandal as a result, were able to turn the tragedy into something of a triumph by heaping praise upon the men and making much noise of their heroism in the face of disaster. Queen Victoria took on a personal interest, and hospitals and memorials were opened in their honour. What the Birkenhead disaster did was cement the idea of women and children first in the public's mind. That was how men should behave in a disaster, it was decided. Any break from that kind of stoicism would be cowardice. The praise for the Birkenhead soldiers approached mania, and in the end, the practice of standing aside so women and children could escape even became known as the Birkenhead Drill. Prussian King Frederick William IV had accounts of the sinking read to every regiment of his army to set the example for his men to follow. Even the notable writer Rudyard Kipling memorialised the sinking in an 1893 poem which read, "To take your chance in the thick of a rush, with firing all about, is nothing so bad when you've covered a hand and leaving and liking to shout. But to stand and be still to the Birkenhead drill is a damn tough bullet to chew. And they done it, the jollies. Her Majesty's jollies, soldier and sailor too. Then, in 1898, the world was stunned when a ship sank and the Birkenhead drill went out the window. The French liner SS La Bourgogne collided with a sailing ship and began to sink. But fights effectively broke out among members of the crew who tried to save themselves. Passengers were beaten away from the boats with oars by crew who tried to take them. Almost half the crew survived, but less than 20% of the passengers did. Of 200 women aboard, only one was saved. Just over 60 of 503 passengers survived. It was an international scandal, a disgrace for the French line, and it called up memories of Birkenhead's loss nearly 40 years earlier. So it was, on the night of April 14th, 1912, as Titanic's crew prepared their own evacuation, the well-known tales of Birkenhead and La Bourgogne repeated in their minds. Captain Smith and his senior officers knew there could be no panic, and they would try to emulate Birkenhead's example. Lightoller, the second officer, allowed no men into the boats at all. Maybe he was trying to avoid a situation like La Bourgogne, where hundreds of men had survived, but only one woman had. The Birkenhead disaster changed the world in its own way, but today though, ship evacuations are much more simple. Passengers are mustered and board the lifeboats in groups regardless of their gender or their standing. But the call for women and children first, which sounded so often throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, was cemented most famously with the sinking of HMS Birkenhead.